What's going on, guys? Reisshub here, back with a VOD review of the FNCS Invitational Week 2, and I'm going to be going over every winner of every region. And as always, if you liked, please like and subscribe if you aren't already. There's a lot to go over today, so I want to keep it as compact as possible, so let's just get right into it. First up, we have Middle East, and our winner there was ASMR Tobi, who won with 362 points. He got 162 points on day 1 and 200 on day 2. Tobi has 6k earnings before this tournament, added another 6k to that, and he placed 10th in week 1 of the Invitational. He hasn't made grand finals of any FNCS before this, and actually qualified, becoming 2nd in the open qualifiers. He landed at the house at the very west of the map near the Stack Shack, looted up there and popped any minis that he got. He doesn't use any of his half pots, as his next rotation is over to the slurp truck. After that, he moves over to the Fancy View house to finish looting there. Ensuring he's farmed enough materials, he rotates back to his drop spot to upgrade his shotgun. He then rotates over to Holly and sneaks onto the roofs looking for beams on other players. After 2 or 3 shots from a controller AR, he either ramp faces into their opponent's box or wall replaces and peanut butter peeks from a ramp to finish the opponent off quickly. Tobi rotates early to 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th zones, sitting on the edge in the earlier zones and getting as far ahead as possible in the 6th zone. When rotating to 5th zone, he has a tendency to do this by foot. There was a game on day 1 where he had 2 launch pads and got near max distance 5th zone and still decided to go by foot. Potentially this is because he doesn't want to get beamed out of the sky and knows he'll be able to get a refresh, as he's so good at getting these in the moving zones. When Tobi did decide to use the launch pad, he nearly always did this from a high layer and used the floor ramp low launch method, which allowed him to take as little damage as possible. His endgames are very aggressive, often using the majority of his materials to rotate to 6th and 7th zone, then aggressively pushing other players on mid-ground layers by facing into their boxes and hitting them with the controller classic. He was very good at picking up eliminations this way, and most of the time got floppers from this playstyle, which he was able to use when low on materials. Next up, we have OCE, which was won by Volx with an astonishing 490 points. He had 246 points in day 1 and 244 points in day 2. Volx has 117k earnings, including 50k from the World Cup duos, and he's 2nd in the power rankings in OCE. He placed 2nd in week 1 and qualified for trios, squads and duos FNCS, which automatically qualified him here for the Invitational. Volx drops Lazy Lake and lands on the roof of No Sweat Insurance building. Once he is looted there, he loots the 2 chests in the courtyard and then the main building. What he did after this varied, but often he pushed over to the southeast building to continue looting or upgraded his pump and then fished in the lake to the west. The most notable part of Volx's strategy comes from his material efficiency, which shows throughout the entire game. Off spawn, he always ensures that he has sufficient materials prior to rotating. In the 2nd and 3rd zones, he always rotates here early and then opts to replace a structure out to replenish his materials, rather than solely focusing on a high ground position. He even sits in wood boxes occasionally because he knows he can refarm this easily. Originally, I was questioning a lot of his 4th and 5th zone rotates, however he seems to rotate through the congested side of the zone very frequently, in contrast to many players who rotate around the dead side. It became apparent to me that he does this so that he can rotate through and around enemy builds to save materials. Once in 4th and 5th zone, he doesn't focus on getting a high ground layer like many other players, he simply sits edge on a low ground layer in a box to conserve his materials. He rotates to 5th by foot, even if he has a launch pad, as he tries to conserve that for the first moving zones. When he does use a launch pad, he doesn't do so immediately as soon as the zone starts to move. He tunnels into zone for a bit first, then pads so that he can land into the 6th zone, choosing a low ground layer to land on. Like I've already said, Volx is an absolute master at conserving materials, and he does this in the moving zones by getting ahead and focus on using old builds to work through. On this 6th zone rotate, he managed to only use 250 wood alone and get safely into the zone. And then he does the same on the 7th zone, barely using any materials and taking 0 damage. He had 555 materials at 5th zone, now at 2 full zones later, he still has 200, 400, 500. However, the downfall of this playstyle is when you get behind on the moving zones. This way you get stuck in enemy builds with a bunch of other players around, and it's easy to get eliminated this way. On his final game of day 1, he decided to drop Shark. He then spent that entire game W-keying everyone in sight by beaming them with the Mythic Scar and then jumping in on them, ending the game with 11 elims. Something to note from this is that he stopped W-keying once the 3rd zone had shrunk. This is because it's risky to fight at this point in the match because it's so easy to get focused, so it's much better just to play for placement at this point. He doesn't get any eliminations in the end game somehow, and then, well, this is how he died. For the Asian region, the first place spot goes to qjappy, I think that's how you pronounce it, but for this I'm just going to call him Q, who won with 329 points, getting 218 points in day 1 and 174 points in day 2. He's ranked 28th in power ranking for the region and placed 48th in week 1. He didn't make squads or duo grand finals, but was invited to this tournament by placing 11th in the trio grand finals. Q dropped at the Henchman House north of Holly Hedges. He then rotated east, hitting houses and chests spread out there. Q played a pretty passive early game, only really taking fights when he needed to or he was pushed. He rotated to the edge of the 2nd, 3rd and 4th zones. If he only has one pad, he prefers to use this on the first moving zones rather than the 50-50 zones. In this particular game, opting to rotate to half in half out by foot despite it being max distance. However, if he didn't have enough materials, he did pad into the half in half out zone. When he does use his launch pad, he nearly always uses a low launch from a high level rather than a full launch. His endgame playstyle is very aggressive, always trying to take as many shots as he can and constantly trying to box fight other players. It's clear he's a very talented box fighter, as many of the mechanics he has in the endgame clearly were developed by a lot of practice. The heavy snipe is a big part of his gameplay, whether it's for long range shots or to pick up an impact frag in someone's box when he's desperate. He uses the heavy sniper extremely efficiently, so much so that his entire drop spot and looting path is focused around getting it. He also hit this absolutely insane play with a grappler to clutch up an additional 15 points in this game. Next up is EU, which is won by no other than the one and only Benjyfishy, who won with 371 points, getting 166 in day 1 and 205 in day 2. Benji's ranked 2nd on EU with the total earnings of an insane 423k. Not only did he win this week, but he also won week 1. He made the grand finals of trios and squads, but didn't manage to make the grand finals for duos. He drops retail row, and this looting path differs most games as he's contested, but when he was uncontested, his preferred looting path was to drop at the doghouse, then loot the bus, harvest the cars to get as much metal as possible, then rotate north through blacktops, going all the way down to the upgrade station to upgrade his pump to purple. He takes mid-game fights unlike a lot of people, but only does this if he gets the advantage or is so confident he just wants to W-key a game. He goes for some sneaky AR shots to damage the opponent, and if he hits multiple he'll push, and if not he'll disengage. He often disengaged from a fight if he didn't have a pump. There were many fights where he got the advantage, but still disengaged because he had a blue tag. Multiple times in these fights, he attempted to take build pieces with his weapons rather than his pickaxe, using the heavy sniper, shotgun, and AR in this one fight. In the earlier zones, he likes to rotate early and get centered, but if he gets a far zone, he will rotate very cleanly towards the dead side of the zone. He also rotates early to 3rd and 4th, sitting centered on 3rd if possible. Then, he sits and does nothing apart from take the occasional heavy snipe between 3rd and 4th zones. This allows him to avoid getting focused and wasting valuable materials and heals. You can see how methodical he is in this clip, where an opponent boxes up beside him without a coner's roof. You can tell Benji wants to heavy snipe in the roof so badly, but he just patiently waits. The opponent covers it up and Benji immediately distances himself from the opponent, realizing there wasn't going to be an opportunity to gain the advantage in this fight. Benji rotates to 5th zone using his pad, doing so as the zone starts to shrink, as this will be when most players will be moving and not looking in the sky. If he doesn't have a pad and sees an opportunity, he will rotate by foot as early as possible. Once he's in the 5th zone, this is where he starts to focus on spraying his opponents. This is because he's invested launch pads and materials at this point, so it's worth going for an impact frag to get a refresh on those. In comparison to 3rd zone, when he has full materials, he's not going to gain a huge amount from getting an impact there, apart from the elimination points. His ability to layer in the endgame is fantastic, constantly moving upwards during his rotates to the 6th zone. This allows him to distance himself from the players on the low ground, while at the same time getting ahead of the zone and seizing opportunities to take height. This is a very consistent way to take height in solos, just taking it at 6th zone, which allows Benji to conserve materials by tarping on high ground and getting some easy eliminations at the same time. When Benji doesn't have height, he's very aggressive in the moving zones, always looking for as many opportunities to get damage off and box up opponents as possible. He doesn't do this by aimlessly jumping into players' boxes, but shows great box fighting skills in the endgame by constantly wall replacing and boxing his opponents up. Okay, so next is Brazil, which was won by Frosty with a nuts 494 points, which was the most of any region. He got 274 points on day 1 and 200 points on day 2. Frosty's ranked 36th on power ranking in the Brazil region and also placed 1st in week 1, similar to Benji. He qualified for this tournament by coming 44th in the grand finals in the FNCS duos. Frosty drops Shark and flies through the mouth. He loots at the very bottom layer, and as soon as he has shields, he finds Sky and eliminates her. Once he's the grapple and mythic scar, he loots the vault as quickly as possible. There were other games where he dropped on the shield barrels, but the looting path was the same, where he just wanted to kill Skye and get to the vault as quickly as possible. Something to note when looting the supply drops in the vault is that you can place the cone and then stand on top of the box to ensure you get the launchpad and weapon. After this, he looks to clear shark, then fishes around the island. It's this winning combo of grappler, Skye's AR and floppers that made him so dominant. Because he is the grappler, he can afford to rotate later than other players, so he can ensure that he gets a lot of hard materials before he leaves his POI. He doesn't just aimlessly double key with his powerful loadout, he rotates around the dead side of the early zones and focuses on getting a good natural high ground spot, early. He bases up on the edge of the second and third zones, sinking his cone for extra protection sometimes. Interestingly, he rotates a lot of zones by foot rather than using the grappler, because if the opponents hear him using the grappler, he'll easily get focused. Because of the grapple, he can position himself in much lower positions, like at the bottom of this waterfall. He does this because this area is less congested and because it's easy for him to escape. At the first moving zones, he grapples ahead of the zone so that he can look back and get elims with the Skye's AR. While ahead of zone, he positions himself close to height. This gives him so many opportunities to go for elims on the players below. This also makes it very easy to get height, showcasing the grappler's true strengths. This is how he managed to get height nearly every time. He had some interesting uses for the floppers, in particular this 1v1 situation for the win. He backed off into the zone using the fish, as this way the opponent had no idea where he was going to peek from, which led to an easy victory royale. Next up we have NA East that was won by SF Roller. He got 163 points on day 1 and 174 on day 2. His win was a bit controversial as he only had 3.2k earnings and the majority of that was being on console. He got 29th in week 1 and qualified for the tournament by placing 48th in the duo grand finals on console. So what was his playstyle? Basically, it was the definition of a controller playstyle. Jumping into boxes with an AR or SMG, lasering down his opponents before they had a chance to breathe. If you play controller and you're not picking up an SMG, you really are missing out, and Roller placing first, winning 40k, should be living proof of that. Roller landed on the hill next to the east of Misty Meadows, landing on the henchman chest there. He then rotated over to the bridge to farm some metal, then up to the lake to loot the houses there. He then fished in the lake to ensure he was also a flopper player. Like many of our other winners, he rotated to 2nd, 3rd and 4th zones early, staying on the edge. The biggest mistake that I found with Roller's gameplay is that he constantly does not have enough materials, both because he didn't farm enough and because he'd overused the materials that he did have. This is particularly the case for the most important material, metal, as the majority of his games he left his drop spot without max metal. This caused him a lot of issues in the end game, meaning that he had to reuse a lot of enemy builds, which is a high risk strategy. He also had to reuse other players' launch pads in moving zones because he didn't get any off spawn most of the time and didn't have enough materials to rotate with. However, because he has floppers, he was able to do this well by sitting in zone, taking a flopper and then using the launch pad. The main takeaway from this is when you're planning your looting paths, ensure you know where you're getting your metal and brick from, and ensure you're harvesting your hard materials early on in your gameplay. Last, but certainly not least, we have NA West, who was won by no other than Epikwhale, with a total of 344 points. He got 200 points on day 1 and 144 on day 2. His earnings make me reconsider my life choices, and he placed 3rd in week 1. He qualified for this tournament by coming 4th in trios, 3rd in squads, and 1st in duo grand finals. Epic dropped agency just like he did in duos, and his looting path was very similar. This obviously changed depending on how many people were contesting him, but when he was uncontested, he landed on the east roof, looting that building until he had full shield, then immediately looked up to Midas to open up the vault ASAP. When he was contested, he was extremely careful when opening the vault, blocking off every angle and even predicting an opponent to push from the west entrance once the key had been used. He was also very careful when killing Midas when contested, as sometimes he sat in a cone from the basement to ensure it was safe. Once he had looted the vault, he fished in the surrounding areas until he had 4 floppers, often taking 3 big pots over 1 or 2 slurpfish. His loot leaving here was always insane, having the mythic drum gun, AR and triple heals. He also opted to not take shotguns because who needs one when you have a drum gun and an AR. He also gets full materials agency, then sits on the roof waiting to see where the further zones are, taking tags on opponent for any storm surge that may come. The scary thing about Epikwhale is not only does he have controller aim, but he also has super clean and effective mechanics, allowing him to finish fights very quickly. He's definitely mastered controller movement too. In this clip, notice how he swerves to the right to avoid being seen by the peeking opponent before jumping straight into his box. Running into opponents' boxes really was his main method to finish up fights and stacking up those elimination points. However, the fights that he chose weren't random. He chose to do these when he needed a refresh or noticed that the opponent was weak, similar to Benji, ensuring that he had the advantage in the fight first before taking it. He gets into a high layer in the 5th zone so that he can hold players that launch and rotate in late. While rotating through the moving zones, his mechanics are very clean, using the optimal amount of materials on nearly every rotate. In game 1 of day 1, he rotated from 5th to 8th zone without taking any damage at all, which he did by ensuring he was ahead of the zone. Thanks guys for watching. If you want to watch any other of my VOD reviews, check my VOD review playlist on YouTube or my previous posts on Reddit. Socials down below here. You want to use my code, use Reisshub, much appreciated that. And hope you guys have a good day. Catch you later.